By the time I visited the site of the Jasenovets camp in 1992, the jackboot was somewhat on the other foot. The Croatian cities of Vukovar and Dubrovnik had been brutally shelled by the armed forces of Serbia, now under the control of Slobodan Milosevic. The mainly Muslim city of Sarajevo had been encircled and was being bombarded around the clock. Elsewhere in Bosnia-Herzegovina, especially along the river Drina, whole towns were pillaged and massacred in what the Serbs themselves termed ethnic cleansing. In point of fact, religious cleansing would have been nearer the mark. Milosevic was an ex-communist bureaucrat who'd mutated into a xenophobic nationalist, and his anti-Muslim crusade, which was a cover for the annexation of Bosnia to a greater Serbia, was to a large extent carried out by unofficial militias operating under his deniable control. These gangs were made up of religious bigots, often blessed by Orthodox priests and bishops, and sometimes augmented by fellow Orthodox volunteers from Greece and Russia. They made a special attempt to destroy all evidence of Ottoman civilization, as in the specially atrocious case of the dynamiting of several historic minarets in Banja Luka, which was done during a ceasefire and not as the result of any battle. The same was true, as is often forgotten, of their Catholic counterparts. The Ustasha formations were revived in Croatia and made a vicious attempt to take over Herzegovina, as they had during the Second World War. The beautiful city of Mostar was also shelled and besieged, and the world-famous Stari Most, or Old Bridge, dating from Turkish times and listed by UNESCO as a cultural site of world importance, was bombarded until it fell into the river below. In effect, the extremist Catholic and Orthodox forces were colluding in a bloody partition and cleansing of Bosnia-Herzegovina. They were, and still are, largely spared the public shame of this because the world's media preferred the simplification of Croat and Serb, and only mentioned religion when discussing the Muslims. But the triad of terms Croat, Serb, and Muslim is unequal and misleading in that it equates two nationalities and one religion. The same blunder is made in a different way in coverage of Iraq, with the Sunni, Shia, Kurd trilateral. There were at least 10,000 Serbs in Sarajevo throughout the siege, and one of the leading commanders of its defence, an officer and gentleman named General Jovan Divjak, whose hand I was proud to shake under fire, was a Serb also. The city's Jewish population, which dated from 1492, also identified itself, for the most part, with the government and the cause of Bosnia. It would have been far more accurate if the press and television had reported that today the Orthodox Christian forces resumed their bombardment of Sarajevo, or yesterday the Catholic militia succeeded in collapsing the Stari Most. But confessional terminology was reserved only for Muslims, even as their murderers went to all the trouble of distinguishing themselves by wearing large Orthodox crosses over their bandoliers, or by taping portraits of the Virgin Mary to their rifle butts. Thus, once again, religion poisons everything, including our own faculties of discernment. As for Bethlehem, I suppose I would be willing to concede to Mr. Prager that on a good day I would feel safe enough standing around outside the Church of the Nativity as evening came on. It is in Bethlehem, not far from Jerusalem, that many believe that with the cooperation of an immaculately conceived virgin, God was delivered of a son. Now the birth of Jesus Christ was in this wise. When his mother Mary was espoused to Joseph, before they came together she was found with child of the Holy Ghost. Yes, and the Greek demigod Perseus was born when the god Jupiter visited the virgin Danae as a shower of gold and got her with child. The god Buddha was born through an opening in his mother's flank. Catlicus the serpent skirted caught a little ball of feathers from the sky and hid it in her bosom, and the Aztec god Huitzilopochtli was thus conceived. The virgin Nana took a pomegranate from the tree, watered by the blood of the slain Agdestris, and laid it in her bosom, and gave birth to the god Attis. The virgin daughter of a Mongol king awoke one night and found herself bathed in a great light, which caused her to give birth to Genghis Khan. Krishna was born of the virgin Devaka. Horus was born of the virgin Isis. Mercury was born of the virgin Maya. Romulus was born of the virgin Rhea Silvia. For some reason, many religions force themselves to think of the birth canal as a one-way street, and even the Koran treats the Virgin Mary with reverence. However, this made no difference during the Crusades, when a papal army set out to recapture Bethlehem and Jerusalem from the Muslims, incidentally destroying many Jewish communities, and sacking heretical Christian Byzantium along the way, and inflicted a great massacre in the narrow streets of Jerusalem where, According to the hysterical and gleeful chroniclers, the spilled blood reached up to the bridles of the horses. Some of these tempests of hatred and bigotry and bloodlust have passed away, though new ones are always impending in this area. But meanwhile a person can feel relatively unmolested in and around Manger Square, which is the centre, as its name suggests, of a tourist trap of such unrelieved tawdriness as to put Lourdes itself to shame. When I first visited this pitiful town, it was under the nominal control of a largely Christian Palestinian municipality, linked to one particular political dynasty identified with the Frege family. When I have seen it since, it has generally been under a brutal curfew imposed by the Israeli military authorities, whose presence on the West Bank is itself not unconnected with belief in certain ancient scriptural prophecies, though this time with a different promise made by a different God to a different people. Now comes the turn of still another religion. The forces of Hamas, who claim the whole of Palestine as an Islamic waqf or holy dispensation sacred to Islam, have begun to elbow aside the Christians of Bethlehem. Their leader, Mahmoud al-Azhar, has announced that all inhabitants of the Islamic State of Palestine will be expected to conform to Muslim law. In Bethlehem, it is now proposed that non-Muslims be subjected to the Al-Jizya tax, the historic levy imposed on dhimmis or unbelievers under the old Ottoman Empire. Female employees of the municipality are forbidden to greet male visitors with a handshake. In Gaza, a young woman named Yusra al-Azami was shot dead in April 2005 for the crime of sitting unchaperoned in a car with her fiancé. The young man escaped with only a vicious beating. The leaders of the Hamas Vice and Virtue Squad justified this casual murder and torture by saying that there had been suspicion of immoral behavior. In once secular Palestine, mobs of sexually repressed young men are conscripted to snoop around parked cars and given permission to do what they like. I once heard the late Abba Eban, one of Israel's more polished and thoughtful diplomats and statesmen, give a talk in New York. The first thing to strike the eye about the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, he said, was the ease of its solubility. From this arresting start, he went on to say, with the authority of a former foreign minister and UN representative, that the essential point was a simple one. Two peoples of roughly equivalent size had a claim to the same land. The solution was, obviously, to create two states side by side. Surely something so self-evident was within the wit of man to encompass. And so it would have been, decades ago, if the messianic rabbis and mullahs and priests could have been kept out of it. But the exclusive claims to God-given authority, made by hysterical clerics on both sides, and further stoked by Armageddon-minded Christians, who hoped to bring on the apocalypse, preceded by the death or conversion of all Jews, have made the situation insufferable, and put the whole of humanity in the position of hostage to a quarrel that now features the threat of nuclear war. Religion poisons everything. As well as a menace to civilization, it has become a threat to human survival. To come last to Baghdad. This is one of the greatest centres of learning and culture in history. It was here that some of the lost works of Aristotle and other Greeks, lost because the Christian authorities had burned some, suppressed others, and closed the schools of philosophy on the grounds that there could have been no useful reflections on morality before the preaching of Jesus, were preserved, retranslated, and transmitted via Andalusia back to the ignorant Christian West. Baghdad's libraries and poets and architects were renowned. Many of these attainments took place under Muslim caliphs, who sometimes permitted and as often repressed their expression. But Baghdad also bears the traces of ancient Chaldean and Nestorian Christianity, and was one of the many centres of the Jewish diaspora. Until the late 1940s, it was home to as many Jews as were living in Jerusalem. I am not here going to elaborate a position on the overthrow of Saddam Hussein in April 2003. I shall simply say that those who regarded his regime as a secular one are deluding themselves. It is true that the Ba'ath Party was founded by a man named Michel Aflaq, a sinister Christian with a sympathy for fascism, and it is also true that membership of that party was open to all religions, though its Jewish membership was, I have every reason to think, limited. However, at least since his calamitous invasion of Iran in 1979, which led to furious accusations from the Iranian theocracy that he was an infidel, Saddam Hussein had decked out his whole rule, which was based in any case on a tribal minority of the Sunni minority, as one of piety and jihad.
The Syrian Ba'ath Party, also based on a confessional fragment of society aligned with the Alawite minority, has likewise enjoyed a long and hypocritical relationship with the Iranian mullahs. Saddam had inscribed the words Allahu Akbar, God is great, on the Iraqi flag. He had sponsored a huge international conference of holy warriors and mullahs, and maintained very warm relations with their other chief state sponsor in the region, namely the genocidal government of Sudan. He had built the largest mosque in the region and named it the Mother of All Battles Mosque, complete with a Quran written in blood that he claimed to be his own. When launching his own genocidal campaign against the mainly Sunni people of Kurdistan, a campaign that involved the thoroughgoing use of chemical atrocity weapons and the murder and deportation of hundreds of thousands of people, he had called it Operation Anfal, borrowing by this term a Quranic justification, the spoils of Surah number 8, for the despoilment and destruction of non-believers. When the coalition forces crossed the Iraqi border, they found Saddam's army dissolving like a sugar lump in hot tea, but met with some quite tenacious resistance from a paramilitary group, stiffened with foreign jihadists, called the Fedahin Saddam. One of the jobs of this group was to execute anybody who publicly welcomed the Western intervention, and some revolting public hangings and mutilations were soon captured on video for all to see. At a minimum, it can be agreed by all that the Iraqi people had endured much in the preceding 35 years of war and dictatorship, that the Saddam regime could not have gone on forever as an outlaw system within international law, and therefore that, whatever objections there might be to the actual means of regime change, the whole society deserved a breathing space in which to consider reconstruction and reconciliation. Not one single minute of breathing space was allowed. Everybody knows the sequel. The supporters of al-Qaeda, led by a Jordanian jailbird named Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, launched a frenzied campaign of murder and sabotage. They not only slew unveiled women and secular journalists and teachers, they not only set off bombs in Christian churches — Iraq's population is perhaps 2% Christian — and shot or maimed Christians who made and sold alcohol. They not only made a video of the mass shooting and throat-cutting of a contingent of Nepalese guest workers who were assumed to be Hindu and thus beyond all consideration. These atrocities might be counted as more or less routine. They directed the most toxic part of their campaign of terror at fellow Muslims. The mosques and funeral processions of the long-oppressed Shiite majority were blown up. Pilgrims coming long distances to the newly accessible shrines at Karbala and Najaf did so at the risk of their lives. In a letter to his leader Osama bin Laden, Zarqawi gave the two main reasons for this extraordinarily evil policy. In the first place, as he wrote, the Shiites were heretics who did not take the correct Salafist path of purity. They were thus a fit prey for the truly holy. In the second place, if a religious war could be induced within Iraqi society, the plans of the Crusader West could be set at naught. The obvious hope was to ignite a counter-response from the Shia themselves, which would drive Sunni Arabs into the arms of their bin Ladenist protectors. And, despite some noble appeals for restraint from the Shiite Grand Ayatollah Sistani, it did not prove very difficult to elicit such a response. Before long, Shia death squads, often garbed in police uniforms, were killing and torturing random members of the Sunni Arab faith. The surreptitious influence of the neighbouring Islamic Republic of Iran was not difficult to detect, and in some Shia areas also it became dangerous to be an unveiled woman or a secular person. Iraq boasts quite a long history of intermarriage and intercommunal cooperation. But a few years of this hateful dialectic soon succeeded in creating an atmosphere of misery, distrust, hostility, and sect-based politics. Once again, religion had poisoned everything.